All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Today, before we get into the book, we're going to do a little research on who is John Birch and how he founded the John Birch Society. And also, it's because I wouldn't say I agree with what Carol Quigley has to say about the John Birch Society, but there is some truth to it. And I think it's the fact that, in the time where John Birch lived, there was more of like a battle between communism and capitalism. But it seems pretty obvious to me that whoever's employing this plan that's in Tragedy and Hope is beyond communism. It's beyond capitalism. Like we can see through the book that the United States really didn't have any problem cooperating with communist countries such as Russia or building up communist countries such as China. So the war, the quote unquote war between capitalism and communism, is a false dialectic on some levels. And I think that's a lot of the reason why Alex Jones' message might even be slightly more popular than John Birch Society, because, he popularized the whole right-left paradigm and how that was a fake thing. That right-left politics were kind of fake. And if you read Tragedy and Hope, you can see that it's kind of fake because obviously the United States was working with almost every European political party during World War I and World War II, built up China, was willing to compromise or work with the Soviet Russians. And it was actually the Soviet Russians that rejected the United States cooperation. So it is kind of a misnomer to say that the war or whatever we're experiencing is between capitalism and communism. It does seem more that it's war for like free people versus these type of monopoly, mafia style combines that want to control everybody and depopulate and turn everybody into robots or replace everybody with robots and put us into AI algorithm type of like, I don't even know, prisons where we're trapped and we can't escape. So let's just look at who John Birch was. This says it's going to take 4 minutes. I don't know if that's the case. All right. Who was John Birch? On August 25th, 1945, 10 days after the end of World War II, a slender 27-year-old captain in the Army Air Forces named John Birch was kidnapped in China by a band of communists. So you can see why he was very opposed to communists. He was captured by communists. 16 years later, John Birch lives on as a rallying symbol of the arch-conservative anti-communist John Birch Society. Yet Birch himself remains a shadowy figure. Who was he? How did he live? And how did he die? John Birch was born in Landore, India, to a husband and wife team of missionaries. When John was 2 years old, his family returned to the U.S., and he was raised in New Jersey and Georgia. In 1939, Birch graduated from Georgia's Baptist-controlled Mercer University as the top man in his class, leaving behind him a record that is still recalled. He was always an angry young man, always a zealot, says a classmate. He felt he was called to defend the faith, and he alone knew what it was, says a psychology professor. He was like a one-way valve, everything coming out and no room to take anything in. In his senior year, Birch organized a secret fellowship group and set out to suppress a mildly liberal trend at Mercer. He and 12 colleagues collected examples of heresy uttered by faculty members, example, a reference to evolution, whipped up support among Georgia's Baptist clergy, and finally forced the school to try 5 men on the charge. Mercer eventually dismissed the cases, but not before admonishing 75-year-old Dr. John D. Freeman, a world-famous Baptist leader, for using a theologically unsound textbook. That summer, Dr. Freeman quietly retired from Mercer. Says a professor, it broke him. Birch went to China as a missionary in 1940 and was caught there by Pearl Harbor. In 1942, as he was trying to find a way to enlist, the war literally dropped in on him. He was taken one night by a native man who had fallen out of the sky, the fallen Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. Birch led Doolittle and a group of the survivors of the Tokyo raid to safety, then joined the unit that later became General Claire Chennault's 14th Air Force and began a remarkable career in air combat intelligence, wrote Chennault later. Birch was the pioneer of our field intelligence net. Traveling up to 100 miles behind enemy lines, Birch radioed back word on prime Japanese targets. He directed the building of 3 airships within enemy territory. For his work, Birch was awarded the Legion of Merit, got a posthumous oak leaf cluster for exceptionally meretricious service. Birch was eventually transferred to the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA, and was assigned late in the war to a tiny, scorpion-infested base at Xi'an in North China. Baptist Birch is remembered as a loner with a somewhat overbearing manner. In his diary, Major Gustav Kraus, commanding officer of the base, gravely noted, "Birch is a good officer, but I'm afraid is too brash and may run into trouble." When the Japanese surrendered, Birch led a routine mission to discover how far south the Chinese communists had penetrated. His group bumped into a Chinese communist force. As the scene has been reconstructed, Birch argued violently with the communist officer who wanted to disarm him. Birch was seized and shot after his hands had been tied. The communist then bayoneted him at least 15 times and tossed his body on a heap of junk and garbage. "In this confusing situation," said Kraus last week, "my instructions were to act with diplomacy." Birch made the communist lieutenant lose face before his own men. Militarily, Birch brought about his own death. Thus, in his lifetime, John Birch was a legitimate hero, but both in his life and death, he was almost as controversial as the organization that has been named after him. So yeah, you can see he was basically a CIA agent that was in China, and he basically was one of the original, CIA agents. So you can see his bias, that he was obviously extremely anti-communist in a war against communists. So you can see how he could believe that there was this war against communists and capitalists. But it does seem, from reading Tragedy and Hope, and I think that's why he's criticizing, John Birch Society and ultra right-wingers for only believing that it's communist, when it's clear in the book that, it's beyond communism, beyond capitalism. It's just about control. It's more of like a technological, biological authoritarianism. You can call it technocracy or scientism, whatever you want to call it. But communism, I don't think, is the correct term for what's happening right now. Maybe you want to say it's international Jewry. You could say that too, maybe. The Freemasons, the Illuminati. Who knows? All right. Still on nuclear rivalry and the Cold War, 1945 to 1950. On page 895. Second paragraph. This extraordinary offer, an offer to give up the American nuclear monopoly, technical secrets, and weapons to an international agency in return for a possibly ineffective system of international inspection, was brusquely rejected by Andrei Gromyko on behalf of the Soviet Union within 5 days. The Soviet spokesman demanded instead a reverse sequence of stages covering 1. Immediate outlawing and destruction of all nuclear weapons with prohibition of their manufacture, possession, or use. 2. A subsequent agreement for exchange of information, peaceful use of atomic energy, and enforcement of regulations. And 3. No tampering whatever with the great power veto in the UN. Since only the United States had the atom bomb at that time, the adoption of this sequence could require the United States to give up the bomb without any assurance that anyone else would do anything. Least of all, adopt any subsequent control methods which might allow the Soviet Union to make its own bombs in secret after the United States had destroyed its in public. The nature of this Soviet suggestion shows clearly that the Soviet Union had no real desire for international control, probably because it was unwilling to open the secret life of the Soviet Union, including bomb making, to international inspection. The Soviet refusal of the American efforts at international nuclear control, like their refusal of American loans and economic cooperation, provides some of the evidence of the Kremlin's state of mind in 1946. This evidence became overwhelming in 1947 and 1948 when the Soviet aggression appeared along the whole crescent of Germany, from Germany across Asia to the Far East. In Germany, as we have seen, the area under Soviet occupation was increasingly isolated from the West and increasingly communized internally. The Soviet military forces encouraged the formation of a dominant German Socialist Unity Party, SED, under communist control. Local provincial elections in the winter of 1946 to 1947 gave victory to the SED in the Soviet zone and to Democratic parties, the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, in the provinces of the three Western zones. Austria was also divided into 4 areas of military occupation, except that it had a single central government of its own under the old Social Democrat leader Karl Renner, who had also been chancellor in 1919. While the Anglo-Americans supported the Austrians against starvation by the use of UNRRA assistance, the Soviet zone was systematically ransacked. This destroyed all communist influence in the country, as was clear when the election of November 1945 reduced them to 4 seats in an assembly of 165 members. Only in May 1955, 2 years after Stalin's death, was it possible to get Soviet consent to a peace treaty and withdrawal of all 4 occupying forces, October 1955. Even the Friends of Russia suffered from Stalin's pressure and his insistence that the Kremlin must remain the center for communist decisions throughout the world. In Yugoslavia, where Tito was originally an anti-Western as Stalin himself, Moscow's efforts to dominate Yugoslavia alienated Tito completely by a combination of economic, diplomatic, and propaganda pressure. The rivalry between the two Slavs came to a head at the end of 1947 when Tito tried to build up a non-Russian communist bloc by signing friendship treaties with Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. By March 1948, a complete break between Belgrade and Moscow was reached. Tito took his place next to Trotsky in Stalin's list of the damned, and the next few years were filled with efforts to overthrow Tito and the purging of Tito sympathizers by Stalin's cooperative jackals and the other communist satellites. Further east, strong Soviet pressure had been put on Greece, Turkey, and Iran since 1945. On Greece, this pressure came through the communist regimes in Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, but in Turkey and Iran it came from the Soviet Union directly. These pressures were probably designed to bring into power in the three countries' governments relatively favorably inclined towards the Soviet Union to the extent that the latter could obtain a veto power over any collaboration of the three with the Western powers, especially with Great Britain. This was an effort in which Stalin had a few good cards and which showed his ignorance of political conditions in countries outside his own. In these three, as in other countries, most people desire two things: political independence and economic aid. Neither of these could be or would be obtainable from Stalin. The first because it violated his imperious nature, and the second because of economic scarcity in the Soviet Union itself. Nevertheless, the effort was made. In Greece, the election of March 31st, 1946, gave the Popular Party, which supported the king, 231 out of 354 seats in the chamber. The following September, a plebiscite on the return of the monarchy gave 69% favorable votes. The communist groups refused to accept these results, and by 1946 were carrying on guerrilla warfare in the mountains, using the three adjacent communist states as bases for supplies, training, and rest areas. A commission of the Security Council of the UN studied the situation in the early months of 1947 and condemned Greece's three northern neighbors, but a Soviet veto stopped any further action by the UN. Instead, the guerrilla leader, General Marcos, set up a Greek provincial government in the mountains, but alienated much support among Greece's impoverished peasants by the banditry of his guerrillas and especially by their kidnapping of thousands of peasant children who were smuggled into the three communist countries for communist indoctrination. Many of these children did not return for 8 or 10 years, and hundreds vanished forever. Large groups returned from Albania as late as 1963. The Soviet pressure on Turkey was uncalled for and totally unremunerative. We have already noted that the Soviet-German Accords of 1940 to 1941 showed Soviet ambitions for bases on the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and for a sphere of political influence south of Bantam and Baku in the general direction of the Persian Gulf. Thus, in this area, as in the Far East, Stalin resumed the expansionist aims of Tsarist Russia. At Potsdam, Stalin had looked even further afield by asking for a trusteeship in the former Italian colony of Libya and a less definite influence in Eritrea on the western shore of the Red Sea. These aims were formally demanded by Moscow in September 1945 and in April 1946, Conference of Foreign Ministers in Paris. Basically, that's like the WEF now. As early as March 19, 1945, Russia denounced its treaty of friendship with Turkey and within a few months made demands, both official and unofficial, for Kars, Trebizond, and other areas of northern Turkey. Anti-Turkish agitation was encouraged among the Kurds and non-Turkish people living at the base of the Anatolian Peninsula and divided among Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. And the Georgia Socialist Soviet Republics demanded 8 Turkish provinces covering much of the Black Sea coast and Kurdistan. On August 8, 1946, Molotov demanded a joint Soviet-Turkish defense of the Straits. Only after Stalin's death on May 30, 1953, did the Kremlin renounce the earlier territorial demands on Turkey, but by that time the alienation was complete. Turkey had been driven into the Western camp, soon allied with Greece and Yugoslavia in a defensive alignment against the North Balkan Soviet state satellites, August 1954, and became the eastern pillar of NATO. The Soviet aggression on Iran began in 1945 when Soviet-sponsored communists under the protection of the Russian armies occupying northern Iran set up independent communist governments at Tabriz and in Iranian Kurdistan. These were apparently intended to be incorporated into Soviet Azerbaijan, and with the Kurdish areas to be taken from Turkey, but the failure of the latter scheme made this impossible. Nevertheless, the Russian army refused to evacuate northern Iran in March 1946, as it was bound to do so by the agreement of January 29, 1941, which had admitted it. Only in May did Iran win Soviet evacuation of its forces by agreeing to form a joint Soviet-Iranian oil company to exploit the petroleum resources of northern Iran, a project which never was fulfilled. By the end of 1946, Britain found the burden of providing military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey too heavy for its overstrained resources. It was, moreover, eager to overcome the American aloofness in the Near East, where it felt it was bearing much of the Soviet pressure alone. Accordingly, in February 1947, it threatened to withdraw completely from Greece and Turkey by April 1st. On March 12th, the American president enunciated the Truman Doctrine to a joint session of Congress. This stated that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. He asked for financial assistance to free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. His request for $400 million for aid to Greece and Turkey was granted, after considerable debate, in May 1947. 2 weeks later, at Harvard's commencement, Secretary of State General George C. Marshall enunciated the Marshall Plan, which offered American economic support for a European recovery program which would include the Soviet Union and other communist states. Once again, Stalin's ignorance committed him to an unrewarding path. He rejected this offer and forced Czechoslovakia, which had previously accepted, to do the same. The path Stalin was following took a more aggressive turn in 1947 and 1948. This involved complete Soviet domination of the areas already under communist control, the shift of communist parties from coalition to opposition in other areas, the instigation of communist outbreaks in colonial areas, especially in the Far East, and the expulsion of the Western powers from their enclave in Berlin. All this was to be achieved while avoiding an open clash with the United States. As part of this process, which was badly bungled everywhere except Czechoslovakia, the communists withdrew from the bourgeois coalition governments which they had joined in 1944 and 1945, in Belgium in March 1947, in France and Italy in May, and in Austria in the autumn. At the same time, agitation from communist-dominated trade unions was increased, and the first post-war large-scale strikes began at the end of the year. As part of the same harassment, the Soviet Union in the UN vetoed applications for membership by Italy and Finland. The states already under communist control, the Soviet influence was intensified by efforts to establish a system in which the local parties and secret police were controlled by Soviet agents in the Russian embassies. As part of this effort, the Third International, or Comintern, which had been dissolved in theory by Stalin in December 1943, but had continued to operate secretly out of Moscow, was reestablished under the new name Cominiform. This was done under Zandov's direction at a meeting of representatives of the communist parties of France, Italy, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, held in Poland, September 1947. The delegates were told by Zhdanov and Georgio Malenkov of the Soviet Union that the world was now divided into two antithetical forces: the imperial group, headed by the United States, and the peace-loving group, headed by the Soviet Union. I'm just laughing because both people just basically have the inverse group view. Whereas, like, the United States would obviously think that they're the peace-loving group and the communists were the imperialist group. And that it was necessary to reestablish direct operational control of the communist parties. The Soviet effort to obtain operational control of the party in Yugoslavia was vigorously resisted by Tito. As a final effort in this direction, Stalin in February 1947 tried to force Yugoslavia into a federation with more docile Bulgaria. Tito flatly refused. As a result, Yugoslavia was expelled from the Cominform in June 1948, and all-out economic, propaganda, ideological, and political warfare was begun by the Soviet bloc against Tito. The conflict was used by Stalin as an excuse to purge all oppositionist communists within the bloc as Titoists. As a part of this struggle, Tito closed the Yugoslav border to the Greek guerrillas, with the results that they, with General Marcos, ended their disturbances in 1949, and Tito became a recipient of American economic aid, which eventually reached $700 million. This process reached its climax with the achievement of the Greek-Yugoslav alliance in 1954. A parallel effort by Stalin to take Czechoslovakia completely into the communist camp was more successful and was, in fact, the most successful of his numerous efforts to increase his power in the last 6 years of his life. In Czechoslovakia, the Russian-trained communist Klement Gottwald had become prime minister in a coalition government in July 1946. In February 1948, the Communist Minister of the Interior replaced 8 Prague police officials by communists, was overruled by the cabinet, but refused to back down, calling out into the streets the workers, militia, armed factory workers, and the police, all three under communist control, to sustain his refusal. When the non-communist ministers protested and some threatened to resign, Gottwald threatened the ill President Beneš with civil war if he did not dismiss 12 non-communist ministers. Beneš, who had been determined to seek support from Russia and not from the Western powers since his unhappy disillusionment with the latter at Munich in September 1938, yielded to Gottwald's demands on February 25, 1948. He himself resigned on May 4th and died in September 1948. His friend, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, son of the founder of Czechoslovakia and the chief Czech advocate of a pro-Western policy, died mysteriously by a fall from a window on May 10th. Yeah, we know that Jan Masaryk definitely killed himself too. The communist control of Czechoslovakia was then complete. Stalin's victory in Czechoslovakia was followed by an even more dramatic defeat in an effort to eject the United States, France, and Britain from their sectors in West Berlin. Apparently, he believed that the United States was considering a withdrawal from Berlin and that the Soviet push would hasten that event. The former belief may have been based on good evidence, but the latter inference from it was quite mistaken. American policy in Germany for almost 3 years, April 1945 to April 1948, was a confusion of conflicting and ambiguous objectives. The basic idea, going back to 1942, was to make it possible for Germany to wage aggressive war again, but no plans had been made, even on a tentative basis, as to how this goal should be sought. Two decisions left unsolved were whether Germany would be broken up and how reparations might be obtained from her without building the country up economically to provide these. Efforts by the State Department to settle these questions were blocked by other departments, notably by the Civil Affairs Division of the War Department, which warned them, left unsettled, by the Treasury Department, which had totally different aims from State. In a far-sighted message from London in August 1944, Ambassador John Winant warned that lack of an agreed reparations policy would inevitably lead to a breakdown of joint Allied control of Germany and to a struggle with Russia for control of Germany. These wise words were ignored, and President Roosevelt, to stop the bickering, postponed all decisions. Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau took advantage of this lacuna and of his close personal friendship with Roosevelt to push forward his own pet scheme to reduce Germany to a purely agricultural state by almost total destruction of her industry, the millions of surplus population to be, if necessary, deported to Africa. What? The secretary, supported by his assistant secretary, Harry Dexter White, was deeply disturbed by Germany's history of aggression and by her efforts to annihilate other races, and was fairly certain that an American relapse into isolationism would make it possible for Germany to try again. The only way to prevent such an attempt, he felt, was to reduce Germany's industry, and thus her war-making capacity, as close to nothing as possible. The resulting chaos, inflation, and misery would be but slight repayments for the horrors Germany had inflicted on others over many years. By personal influence, Morgenthau obtained acceptance of a somewhat modified version of this plan by both Roosevelt and Churchill at the Quebec Conference of September 1944. There is little doubt that Churchill's approval had been won by his scientific advisor, Lord Sherwell, who had personal animosities against Germany and had been the chief civilian advocate of indiscriminate bombing of German cities. The error at Quebec was quickly repudiated, but no real planning was done, and the Morgenthau Plan played a considerable role in JCS 1067, the directive to set up a guide to guide the American military occupation of Germany. In the same context, the vague and unsettled reparations discussion at Yalta proposed that reparations of $20,000 million, which I think is $20 billion, of which half go to Russia, be obtained by the dismantling of German industry. The JCS 1067 directive ordered that Germany be treated as a defeated enemy and not as a liberated country, with the chief objective that of preventing future German aggression. No steps were to be taken to secure its economic recovery. At the Potsdam Conference, it was agreed that the German economy should not be permitted to recover higher than a level which would sustain the occupation forces and displaced refugee persons, with standards of living for German peoples themselves no higher than the average standard of living of other European countries. This rather ambiguous level was subsequently defined as equal to the German standard of living of 1932, at the bottom of the Depression, the level, in fact, which had brought Hitler to power in January 1933. It took more than 2 years of misery for Germany and frustrating relations with the Soviet occupation forces to secure any change in these American objectives. During these 2 years, lack of equipment, of fertilizers, and of encouragement to enterprise made German economic and social conditions worsen until the end of 1947. Much of the country was still in ruins, housing was lacking, production of food and coal were in almost total collapse. Unemployment was very high, inflation was rampant, crime, especially from bands of displaced persons, ex Nazis, and juvenile delinquents, was widespread, and the black market, using cigarettes as a monetary standard, was flourishing. Hunger and cold in the winter took a considerable toll, and the Germans for 2 years experienced some of the misery they had inflicted on others in the preceding dozen or more years. Without a revival of industry, which was hampered by disarmament, reparations, and war damage, it was impossible to resume the two vital necessities of recovery: increasing mining of coal and export of industrial products to pay for food imports. By the end of 1947, the Americans and British were thoroughly tired of paying astronomical sums each year to keep food flowing to Western Germany. All efforts to make an economic reunion with Eastern Germany failed because of Soviet insistence that such a reestablishment of interchange of food for industrial products between the two halves of Germany must be tied in with recognition of renewed Soviet claims for $10 billion in reparations payments to be taken from current production, 2 points which had been unsettled by the wartime agreements. To revive German industry so that it could pay for imports for food, the Anglo-Americans devised a reform of the German currency. The Soviet government objected violently to this because it might work, but also because it would inevitably bind West Germany economically to the West. If the products of a revived West German industry could not be exchanged for Eastern European food, they would have to be exchanged for food and raw materials from the West. The German currency reform of 1948 is the fiscal miracle of the post-war world. From it came 1. An explosion of industrial expansion and economic prosperity for West Germany, 2. The tying of the West German economy to the West, 3. An example and model for other Western European countries and for Japan in economic expansion, and 4. A wave of prosperity for Western Europe as a whole, which continued year after year and refuted completely the claims of communist or even socialist, and to a lesser extent the claims of American businessmen that they held the sole key to prosperity. The reform, which went into effect on June 1st, 1948, drastically reduced the volume of money in Western Germany by exchanging new Deutschmarks for the current Reichsmarks on a 1-to-1 basis for the first 60, but on a 6.5 to 100 basis for all over 60. The new marks were blocked in banking accounts in complicated ways which encouraged their use for production. Interesting. The Soviet Union used the monetary reform in West Germany as an excuse for its blockade of Berlin, which lasted in extreme form from June 24, 1948 to May 12, 1949, although it had begun on a partial basis on March 31st. It began in an atmosphere of rapidly rising East-West tension. In December 1947, the King of Romania was forced into abdication and exile. Shortly after the new year, the SED in East Germany was purged of any leaders likely to show independence towards Stalin. The Czech takeover in February 1948 was preceded by Soviet invitations to Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and Finland to sign military alliances with Russia. All did so, but the Finnish delegates in February flatly refused Stalin's demands that the Soviets have the right to move troops into Finland on its own decision. In Italy, on April 18, 1948,
Desperate communist efforts to get a strong foothold in the Italian government were defeated in the first general elections under the new Republican Constitution. This election marks the turning point in post-war Italian history, just as the simultaneous Berlin crisis and monetary reform mark the turning point in post-war German history. The Communists had participated in all three of Italy's post-war governments under the Christian Democrat Prime Minister Alice di Gasperi, but went into opposition in his fourth government, set up on May 31st, 1947, as they did in all countries of Western Europe about the same time. The new Constitution of January 1st, 1948, required a new election during which the fate of newly democratic Italy hung in the balance. The results were a great defeat for the Communists, who obtained only 182 seats in their Popular Front alliance with the left-wing Socialists, compared to 307 Christian Democrat members in the Assembly of 570 seats. The Soviet decision to push the Western powers out of their occupation sectors in Western Berlin was part of this general Soviet movement. It was accompanied by claims that the whole city was an integral part of the Soviet occupation zone of Eastern Germany, and that the Western powers were present there only on sufferance. To this, the Western powers answered that their presence in Berlin was on exactly the same basis as that of the Russians To this, the Western powers answered that their presence in Berlin was on exactly the same basis as that of the Russians, the right of conquest. The Kremlin at no time admitted that it was establishing a blockade or that its aim was to eject the Western powers. Its aims, rather, were to close access to smugglers, criminals, and eventually to new illegal marks introduced by the monetary reform. As we have seen, through the neglect of General Lucius Clay as Eisenhower's deputy in 1945, the Western powers had obtained no Soviet recognition of their access rights to Berlin from the Western occupation zones of Germany. Rail, canal, road, and air traffic to the west were under Soviet control and were constantly harassed by shifting regulations, delays, and open obstacles. By the early months of 1948, rail and road routes were tied in knots, and air traffic along the recognized corridor was jeopardized by trespassing Soviet fighter planes, intruding barrage balloons, and unannounced aircraft gunfire. On May 5th, a Russian fighter pilot buzzing a British transport plane as it approached Berlin collided with it and killed himself and the 15 persons on the British plane. On June 24th, all traffic by ground to Berlin from the west was closed on a variety of excuses, and only the harassed air corridor was open. Hopes of supplying the 2 million persons in the western sectors of the city by air were dim, as the population's need for food was now over 2,000 tons a day, and the need for coal for power would be just about 5,000 tons a day, excluding home heating. Nevertheless, the attempt began. Day after day, the operation became more intense and more efficient, with planes landing originally at 2, later at 3 airports as fast as they could get in. This continued night and day and reached 3,000 tons in 362 planes on July 5th, and erratically crept upward in spite of the deteriorating weather conditions and lengthening darkness through the winter. In September, the city government, broken up by communist mobs, moved from the Soviet sector to the western part of the city, but was replaced by a new, completely communist city government in the eastern sector. The Western powers stopped all goods flowing between zones to the east and began to merge the three zones of the Western powers and took steps to create a Western German government to rule over them in succession to the military occupation regime. To indicate the temporary nature of the new system until the reunion of Eastern Germany could permit establishment of a permanent government, the new regulations were called a basic law rather than a constitution and were drawn up by a council of delegates from the provincial assemblies rather than an elected constituent assembly. The new West German regime began to operate in May 1949, in the same month as the ending of the Berlin blockade. The Berlin blockade was won by the West because of the tireless efficiency of the aircraft and the resolute determination of the Berliners themselves to undergo any personal hardship or death rather than to submit to another despotic government. Food was scarce, other supplies non existent, and heat almost totally lacking through the winter of 1948 to 1949. Some starved and many froze, but the resistance did not waver, and the airlift went on, night and day, in spite of weather, weariness, and accidents, which killed 61 airmen. The planes roared in and out again. Soviet harassment of the airlift by night flying on instruments in the air corridor was never sufficient to stop it, as the Soviet clearly feared to push the dispute to open conflict. By September, planes were landing around the clock every 3 minutes. Daily tonnage crept upward past 5,000 tons a day as the new year opened, and by April passed 8,000 tons a day. One day that month, 1,398 planes, landing every 62 seconds, delivered 12,941 tons of supplies. The Soviet blockade had been defeated. On May 12th, after elaborate negotiations, the ground routes to the city were reopened. In 11 months, the American airlift had landed more than 1.6 million tons of freight in about 200,000 flights, a demonstration which undoubtedly awed even the Russians. And in the interval, West Germany had been united from 3 zones to 1 and had obtained its own German government. The West German elections of August 14, 1949, gave the Christian Democrats 31% of the vote, with 139 seats in the parliament. The chief opposition party, the Social Democratic, had 29% with 131 seats. The Communists, with 5%, had 15 seats, were in fifth place after two other minority groups, the Conservative Centralist Free Democrats with 52 seats, and the moderate anti-Prussian Federalist German Party with 17 seats. Though the first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, an anti-Nazi who had been imprisoned by Hitler, won his post by only a single vote, he kept it until 1963. All right. The next section is going to be the crisis in China, 1945 to 1950. That's on page 904. If you want to read ahead, link to the PDF is in the description. Let's check out another little quick history tidbit. Let's see if I might have some actual photos in there.
Not very good photos. So yeah, this is what it looks like. This was basically like the line in between East and West Germany. And there's like a bunch of stories about people doing all types of crazy stuff to get across to West Germany, like people stuffing themselves inside of like false trunks and fake engines inside of cars. There was a story about somebody zip lining across electrical wire like miles in the rain at night in order to cross. People hopping on trains and all types of other stuff. Basically, any way that they could figure out how to get across from East Germany to West Germany, they tried it basically. And it seems like a really unassuming place, but obviously there was a lot of stuff going on here. Now there's a McDonald's there. Of course, now there's a McDonald's right there. Let's see what it'll look like more historically. Yeah, that's what it'll look like. So that was basically like the line in between East and West Germany. Was this spot right here. Checkpoint Charlie, if you want to look into the history of that more, but I mean, that's pretty much it. That was the line. All right. That's all I got for today. Thanks for watching. If you did, if you didn't, you won't hear this. So otherwise, have a good day and peace.